Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Full Metal Cast. It's been a while since I put out an episode, not since me and the fellows gathered out on the patio for cigars and some drinks and just talked about absolute and utter nonsense. A lot has happened since. Obviously, the election concluded, and the God Emperor found his way back to the throne. God, a lot to unpack here, and sort of. You might hear the dog freaking out in the back. He can't help it sometimes if he finds a toy. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today, in fact, entirely what I'm going to talk about today, is going to be based on or around sort of the election and things I observed during, leading up to, and after that I found very interesting, and using all of that in the context. All right, I got to stop this dog. Hey, do you mind? Yeah, you. You're being a little bit of a menace right now. I'm in the middle of something. All right, I think he's got it out of his system now. But yes, the election, what I observed leading up to, during, and after, in the sphere that we all sort of operate in, and just thoughts about government in general, in the context of sort of Tolstoy's view, as I am rereading probably for the dozenth time. Government is Violence, which is basically his collection of anarchist and pacifist essays from the early 1900s, I think, and on. So I sort of just basically took some notes and wrote down my favorite, just sort of like short essays and sort of blurbs from the longer ones that I found to be incredibly relevant, not only to the election, but just to the state of government today. And again, let me be clear, I think all government, no matter who sits on the throne, is evil. I think you are a slave so long as there are people that can make rules and enforce those rules through violence. And that's what government is. That's all that it is. It's not to necessarily do good, and we'll get into this with some of the writings here. But their purpose now, and the government today, it's a business. It's designed to generate money for those who you have elected, and you elect them under the pretense that they're going to represent you and do good things. But history and sort of the facts is that these people go in, abuse their power, and accumulate levels of wealth that you and I will never know and never see. And if you don't pay them, if you don't pay your taxes, they'll roll up, they'll throw you in jail, or they'll kill you if you resist. And I don't want to sort of jump ahead and really sort of, I guess, spoil Tolstoy's words here that really have formed mine, and that's not something new. I've said from the beginning, once I really discovered Tolstoy, he is one of the people who came before that I really identify with most and really respect the most regarding his view on government, solutions, and just living a life sort of under the boot. So I guess with that, I'm going to jump into it. I'm going to read one of the early essays in this collection, simply called On Anarchy. It's from the year 1900. It's literally 1, 2, 3-ish pages here. So bear with me as I am just finishing up my second coffee this morning, took the dog out, and so surely reading some old text is going to come through very coherently. So here we go. On Anarchy, Leo Tolstoy, 1900. The anarchists are right in everything, in the negation of the existing order and in the assertion that without authority there could not be worse violence than that of authority under existing conditions. They are mistaken only in thinking that anarchy can be instituted by a violent revolution. To establish anarchy, anarchy will be instituted, but it will be instituted only by there being more and more people who do not require the protection of governmental power, and by there being more and more people who will be ashamed by applying this power. The capitalistic organization will pass into the hands of workers, and then there will be no more oppression of these workers and no unequal distribution of earnings. But who will establish the works? Who will administer them? It will go on of its own accord. The workmen themselves will arrange everything. But the capitalistic organization was established just because, for every practical affair, there is need for administrators furnished with power. If there be work, there will be leadership, administrators with power. And when there is power, there will be abuse of it, the very thing against which you are now striving. To the question, how to be without a state, without courts, armies, and so on, an answer cannot be given, because the question is badly formulated. The problem is not how to arrange a state after the pattern of today or after a new pattern. Neither I nor any of us is appointed to settle that question. But, though voluntarily, yet inevitably, must we answer the question, how shall I act faced with the problem whichever arises before me? Am I to submit my conscience to the acts taking place around me? Am I to proclaim myself in agreement with the government which hangs erring men, sends soldiers to murder, demoralizes nations with opium and spirits, and so on? Or am I to submit my actions to conscience, i.e., not participate in government, the actions of which are contrary to my reason? What will be the outcome of this? What kind of government there will be? Of all this I know nothing. Not that I wish to know, but that I cannot. I only know that nothing evil can result from my following the higher guidance of wisdom and love, or wise love, which is implanted in me, just as nothing evil comes of the bee following instinct implanted in her and flying out of the hive with the swarm, we should say, to ruin. But I repeat, I do not wish to and cannot judge about this. In this precisely consists the power of Christ's teachings, and that not because Christ is God or a great man, but because his teaching is irrefutable. The merit of his teaching consists in the fact that it has transferred the matter from the domain of eternal doubt and conjecture onto the ground of certainty. Thou art a man, a being rational and kind, and thou knowest that today or tomorrow thou wilt die, disappear. If there be a God, then thou wilt go to him, and he will ask of thee an account of thy actions, whether thou hast acted in accordance with his law, or at least with the higher qualities implanted in thee. If there be no God, thou regardest reason and love as the highest qualities, and must submit to them, thy other inclinations, and not let them submit to thy animal nature, to the cares about the commodities of life, to the fear of annoyance and material calamities. Wow, that was a pain in the ass to read first thing in the morning. The question is not, I repeat, which community will be the more secure, the better, the one which is defended by arms, cannons, gallows, or the one that is not so safeguarded. But there is only one question for a good man, and one it is impossible to evade. Wilt thou, a rational and good being, having for a moment appeared in this world, and at any moment liable to disappear, wilt thou take part in the murder of erring men, or men of a different race? Wilt thou participate in the extermination of whole nations of so-called savages? Wilt thou participate in the artificial deterioration of generations of men by means of opium and spirits for the sake of profit? Wilt thou participate in all these actions, or even be in agreement with those who permit them, or wilt thou not? And there can only be but one answer to this question, for those to whom it has presented itself. As to what the outcome will be of it, I don't know, because it is not given to me to know. But what should be done, I do unmistakably know. And if you ask what will happen, then I will reply that good will certainly happen, because acting in the way indicated by reason and love, I am acting in accordance with the highest law known to me. The situation of the majority of men enlightened by true brotherly enlightenment, a little redundant, at present crushed by the deceit and cunning of usurpers who are forcing them to ruin their own lives, this situation is terrible and appears hopeless. Only two issues present themselves, and both are closed. One is to destroy violence, by terrorism, dynamite bombs, and daggers, as our nihilists and anarchists have attempted to do. To destroy this conspiracy of governments against nations from without. The other is to come to an agreement with the government, making concessions to it, participating in it, in order gradually to disentangle the net which is binding the people and to set them free. Both these issues are closed. Dynamite and the dagger, as experience has already shown, only cause reaction and destroy the most valuable power, the only one at our command, that of public opinion. The other issue is closed, because governments have already learned how far they may allow the participation of men wishing to reform them. They admit only that which does not infringe, which is not essential, and they are very sensitive concerning things harmful to them, sensitive because the matter concerns their own existence. They admit men who do not share their views and who desire reform, not only in order to satisfy the demands of these men, but also in their own interest, in that of the government. These men are dangerous to the governments if they remain outside them and revolt against them, opposing to the governments the only effective instrument the government possesses, public opinion. They must, therefore, render these men harmless, attracting them by means of concessions in order to render them innocuous, like cultivated microbes, and then make them serve the aims of the governments, i.e., oppress and exploit the masses. Both these issues being firmly closed and impregnable, said that right, what remains to be done? To use violence is impossible. It would only cause reaction. To join the ranks of the government is also impossible. One would only become its instrument. One course, therefore, remains: to fight the government by means of thought, speech, actions, life, neither yielding to government nor joining its ranks, and thereby increasing its power. This alone is needed, will certainly be successful, and this will be the will of God, the teaching of Christ. There can be only one permanent revolution, a moral one, the regeneration of the inner man. How is this revolution to take place? Nobody knows how it will take place in humanity, but every man feels it clearly in himself. And yet, in our world, everybody thinks of changing humanity, and nobody thinks of changing himself. All right, so that is short essay on anarchy. I'm very clearly still waking up. Said a lot of words wrong. Probably skipped a couple words too. Let's unpack that a little bit here. Great way to kick things off. I'll flip to the next one I'm going to read here. Very clearly outright states his fact that to support, participate in government goes against the teaching of Christ. And I guess a little background, Tolstoy fell out of love with the church because of how state-like and governmental they act, but very much a Christian anarchist and very much, adheres to the teachings of Christ. And I do like how he's tried to make that as applicable as possible to people who may be on the outside of it, something that I think the church today is really, really bad. He could have just said, Jesus says this, this, and this, all these Bible verses on why you should listen to him and how you should act. And sometimes it doesn't stick to people who, are on the outside or maybe who have fallen out or are skeptical. And you should rightfully be skeptical of man-made institutions run by men. We're frail. Remember the pillars of this show, which I haven't revisited in a while. But everything man touches, it's going to be flawed because that's just who we are. We're not omnipotent beings. We're not all-knowing gods. We are emotional people. But it was cool just to say, like, even if, we're not saying it's Christ, Christ's law, you basically just love one another. You respect one another. It's that respecting and that honoring of natural rights that I come back to time and time again. And I owe that to Tolstoy because that's what really resonated with me as I've read all the works of, famous writers and revolutionaries and whatnot on freedom and rights and, way things ought to be. I also like how he emphasizes that violence is not the way, it's only reactionary, and you're going to turn off a lot of people with violence, right? I always have said it is in your greatest interest to avoid a civil war, peer-to-peer conflict. And I always reference the Civil War death toll and how it makes the American death tolls in both world wars and every other top, all the other deadly wars we were involved in. If you rack up the top 10 and add them all together, you can fit another World War I and II in there, I think, before you reach the Civil War death toll, which is incredible. Not incredible, but terrifying. You don't want that. There's horrors beyond comprehension. And he mentioned it, you go down that route of violence, you're going to lose public opinion. People are going to just say, enough of this. It's not worth the human capital. He also says, fixing it from the inside ain't possible either. He says both issues are closed when you when you think about changing how things are done or freeing yourself from the government. Getting in there to sort of disentangle the masses from the government, as he said, isn't possible because of how the playing field is leveled, how it's set, how the rules are made. And I've mentioned this as well. You can't even run for president unless you basically promise enough kickbacks to the people who are already in it or the people who are funding it. And I think this election is probably one of the greatest examples. One of the candidates wasn't even voted on to run. She was just anointed. She was appointed by the state, and you had to deal with it. And I've said when it happened, it shouldn't matter whether you vote red or blue. That should infuriate you. They're just pissing on you blatantly at that point. They're not even bothering calling it rain when they did that. They just said, open your fucking mouths. We're going to do this. And there's fuck all you can do about it, peasants. And then obviously, once those people are in there, they're hindered by bureaucracy, by red tape, by people who can just make the rules up as they go. And just common sense, common logic does not apply in the political world. And you can see that because there are different rules for different people within it. And I brought this up to a coworker of mine. We get lunch pretty regularly, and he's very politically fired up about things, which most people are, I understand. And he's stating all these things about, what politician said this, and isn't that bullshit? Like, that's just not true. That's a lie. I was like, oh, you poor thing. Like, do you know Santa and the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy aren't real too? Like, politicians lie. To believe anything in anything that the government does or that you think that they're going to do is like thinking the Fast and Furious movies are a documentary. Like, the level of disbelief and the suspension of reality you need to have in order to think that the government is there to help, or that they're going to do what they say they're going to do, or that whatever comes out of their mouths is of reality, it's insane, right? Like, these are the people who what happened today? There's something so ridiculous. Like, I can't believe like we're even talking about certain things that they talk about while like everything else is going on in the world that is going on. But I'm like, this is a non-issue. Like, how is this so, like, how are these headlines really headlines? And if you watch the news cycle, you get it, right? It's like, how is this what we're talking about? How is this real? Like, it's not real. Like, it's hard for people to afford to feed themselves. It's hard for people to put a roof over their head. It's hard for people to pay for and do anything today, harder than it's ever been. That's not true, but in recent history, right? Like, there's a lot of tension and a lot of things arising from issues like affordability, inflation, all that we've seen on the back end of the pandemic. And we're talking about just non-issues on the news that are just these political powder kegs for some reason that the everyday man just does not identify with. But because they're political, people latch onto them with emotional fervor, like you're watching your favorite sports team. Like, it's just a total disconnect. And not that just all goes to say that like fixing it from the inside isn't a viable option, because once you're in there, and I think Trump's probably the best example in term one, and he basically came out and straight up said it as he was running this year why you should vote for him. He used it. It was hilarious. Term one, he said he's going to clean empty the swamp, drain the swamp. Not much draining happened. You still have all the war hawks in there, all the insider traders, all the people, operating by their own rules, enforcing rules on all of us while they don't have to follow them. Just the same scumbags are doing the exact same scumbag things. And oh, by the way, speaking of the swamp has been running the country, quote unquote, since the first debate. We have not had a president, or a vice president for that matter, since the first debate, when they kicked Biden down the stairs, said Kamala's going to run in this next election. Biden might as well have been dead. He's not done anything as president. He is, hardly to be seen anywhere doing anything presidential or leading the country. And Kamala was too busy running her own campaign to do her duties as vice president. So we had a machine, a swamp, whatever you want to call it, running this country, and it has been running this country since that first debate, while we have been on potentially 2 nuclear war, proxy war fronts, whatever you want to call them, with a third possibly boiling up in the Pacific. And we don't have a president or a vice president because the machine is running. The machine is alive and well, and it always will be. It's run by people who you have never seen, who you will never know, who you have never voted for, who have likely occupied those positions for most of their lives and will continue to do so until they die or they anoint the next person who will come after them. Don't bark. I see you huffing and puffing. I'm huffing and puffing too. All that to say, fixing it from the inside doesn't work. And I think JFK is a great example of what happens when you try to fix it from the inside. They just open your brain on public television for all to see. They just don't care. Or like Trump, like the example I was going down there before I got a little fired up, they just throw the book at you, whether it's legal, whether there's any precedent for it, whether it's even viable, doesn't matter. They will bog you down. They will make it impossible for you to implement any change or do anything if you are a true threat to them. And if you are, then welcome to the good old Boys and Girls Club, and you can come in here and insider trade and make all the copious amounts of wealth you possibly want. So long as you play ball, we won't look into you and we won't throw you behind bars. Just toe the fucking line. So therefore, violence and changing from the inside are not viable options. The third, however, he brings up at the end, he mentions, that we'll circle back with some other ones, is the non-participation, the non-action, the non-compliance, the civil disobedience. To completely reject and not participate and support the government is the only way to go about implementing true change. It's like that moral revolution, the spiritual revolution. An attitude shift has to change in people in order for there to be any true change in government at all for the betterment of all of us. The voters, the non-voters, the civilians, however you want to call us, the people who the government is supposed to serve. These people are servants. That's all that they are. They're not celebrities. They're not superstars. They're not superheroes. Mind you, these are people who cannot work a McDonald's unless it is staged and shut down for them. I still stand by this, you are likely more qualified to run any of the positions in the government that anyone who is in there currently is, I would say. I truly do believe that these people have done nothing. Their resumes are truly pathetic, and the only way that they can possibly survive and put food on their own table is to get in power, is to be a part of the government so that they can abuse said power to, get donations, kickbacks, insider trading, all that stuff to make money. It's their living. It's not seen as a position of servitude. It's seen as a way of living, and it's parasitic to you. So the shift that has to happen is people need to realize that it's unnatural, it's unhealthy, and it's immoral to support, to work for, to do anything to help the government. And it should be seen as shameful. It should be laughed at. People should be outcasted for sort of participating in and taking pride in being a part of and supporting a government. And I'll hopefully read a little more here that sort of helps shift that. And he talks a lot about patriotism in these essays. I'm not sure if the ones I have flagged, if he really goes into it. And I feel like it's important rather to address, because patriotism in this is the conflation that, your government is your country and your country is your government. And that you should be rah, go get 'em tiger for your country every step of the way in lockstep with your government. There are weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. Go get 'em, baby. Rah, we're the best. What the fuck is a kilometer? Here comes democracy. Give us your oil, sort of thing. Like, that's bad, right? That only sort of breathes more legitimacy and fire. That's that public opinion that's sort of going into the government's sort of what's the word for it? It'll come back to me. It empowers them to do what they do. They know that they have the court of public opinion. They know they have the people's trust for the most part, and they can do whatever they want because the patriotism level is so high. I've always said, if you love your country, you hate your government because they're killing it. They're killing your country little by little every single day. And you see that with all the stupid legislations, giving away land to foreign countries, destroying the natural beauty to put up battery plants or solar farms or wind turbines or whatever. Just acting in their own interest, to gain votes, to get money, whatever it is, raping you of your paycheck and your earnings, raping the earth for its natural minerals and its beauty. That's sort of like, so all I have to say, when you hear patriotism equals bad, it's not to say you shouldn't have pride and love for your country. It's that you shouldn't have pride and love for the actions of your government, especially when those actions are going to trample over other people. So I just wanted to address that. But that was a lot of word soup. Hopefully some of that made sense. This one seems to be a little bit longer. This one is called Thou Shall Not Kill, also written in 1900. Tolstoy, obviously, these are all his essays. Take a drink of coffee here. When kings are executed after trial, as is the case with Charles I, Louis IX, and Maximilian of Mexico. By the way, so for those who don't know, Tolstoy is Russian. A lot of this, his sort of view and what he writes about is about the Russian, like the Soviet era, like Russian government. That being said, why it's even more powerful, why these writings are more sort of, I guess, influential now that they're so relatable, considering when and where and what he's writing about. But you're going to hear names and sort of references to things in the past and from Russian history, and just world history in general from the Russian point of view from back in the early 1900s or late 1800s that may not make sense. There are notes in the back that sort of reference some of these names, places, battles, and whatnot. So I may go back and share those pictures. I may not. But if you hear a name, if you hear a country or reference to a place that may be new to you, maybe Google it, maybe look it up. But just know this is not like in the shoes of like, you know, American like history and whatnot. So just had to put that out there. Anywho, Maximilian of Mexico, or when they are killed in court conspiracies like Peter III, Paul, and various sultans, shahs, and khans. Little is said about it, but when they are killed without a trial and without a court conspiracy, as is the case with Henry IV of France, Alexander II, the Empress of Astoria, and the late Shah of Persia, and recently Humbert. Such murders excite the greatest surprise and indignation among kings and emperors and their adherents, just as if they themselves never took part in murders, nor profited by them, nor instigated them. But in fact, the mildest of the murdered kings, Alexander II or Humbert, for instance, not to speak of executions in their own countries, were instigators of, and accomplices and partakers in, the murder of tens of thousands of men who perished on the field of battle, while more cruel kings and emperors have been guilty of hundreds of thousands and even millions of murders. The teaching of Christ repeals the law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but those who have always clung to that law and still cling to it, and who apply it to a terrible degree, not only claiming an eye for an eye, but without provocation decreeing the slaughter of thousands as they do when they declare war, have no right to be indignant at the application of that same law to themselves in no small and insignificant a degree that hardly one king or emperor is killed for each 100,000, or perhaps even for each million, who are killed by the order and with the consent of kings and emperors. Kings and emperors not only should not be indignant at such murders as those of Alexander II and Humbert, but they should be surprised that such murders are so rare, considering the continual and universal example of murder that they give to mankind. Tolstoy kind of doing a heat check here. This would be like, so like back in the day, you know, if didn't like a ruler, big court, you know, sort of got together, said, yep, kill them, they're bad. That was like big news, but it wasn't like, oh my God, it wasn't this huge talking point. But whenever a king or a ruler was assassinated, you know, other people in the government, you know, other kings and rulers would go, oh my God, I can't believe this. This is just not okay. This is unacceptable. Tolstoy's sort of going, shut the fuck up. You guys are murderers or directly responsible for the murder of, you know, tens, thousands, hundreds, millions of people. You should be surprised it's not happening more. It's not happening to you right now. I do respect that. That's pretty sweet. I take a sip of my coffee. Going on though, the crowd are so hypnotized that they see what is going on before their eyes, but do not understand its meaning. They see what constant care kings, emperors, and presidents devote to their disciplined armies. They see the reviews, parades, and maneuvers the rulers hold, about which they boast to one another, and the people crowd to see their own brothers, brightly dressed up in fool's clothes, turned into machines to the sound of drum and trumpet, all at the shout of one man, making one and the same movement at one at the same moment. But they do not understand what it all means. Yet the meaning of this drilling is very clear and simple. It is nothing but a preparation for killing. It is stupefying men in order to make them fit instruments for murder, and those who do this, who chiefly direct this, are proud of it, are the kings, emperors, and presidents. And it is just these men who are specially occupied in organizing murder and to have made murder their profession, who wear military uniforms and carry murderous weapons, swords, at their sides. They are horrified and indignant when one of themselves is murdered. The murder of kings, the murder of Humbert, is terrible, but not on account of its cruelty. The things done by command of kings and emperors, not only past events such as the massacre of St. Bartholomew, religious butcheries, the terrible repressions of peasant rebellions, and Paris coup d'etat, but the present-day government executions, the doing to death of prisoners in solitary confinement, The disciplinary battalions, the hangings, the beheadings, the shootings, and slaughters in war are incomparably more cruel than the murders committed by anarchists. Nor are these murders terrible because undeserved. If Alexander II and Humbert did not deserve death, still less did the thousands of Russians who perished at Plevna, interesting, or of Italians who perished in Abyssinia. Such murders are terrible, not because they are cruel or unmerited, but because of the unreasonableness of those who commit them. If the regicides act under the influence of personal feelings of indignation evoked by the sufferings of an oppressed people, for which they hold Alexander or Carnot or Humbert responsible, or if they act from personal feelings of revenge, then however immoral the conduct may be, it is at least intelligible. But how is it that a body of men, anarchists were told, such as those by whom Bresci was sent, and who we are now threatening another emperor, how is it that they cannot devise any better means of improving the condition of humanity than by killing people whose destruction can no more be of use than the decapitation of that mythical monster on whose neck a new head appeared as soon as one was cut off? Kings and emperors have long ago arranged for themselves a system like that of a magazine rifle. As soon as one bullet has seen discharged, another takes its place. There's a French term here I'm not going to bother reading. So what is the use of killing them? So that's an interesting one. He basically says, as long as he believes killing is, how immoral and unjustified it can ever be, he can at least make sense of political violence, of political assassinations. And that they make much more sense than sending our own brothers and sisters across the sea to go kill other people's brothers and sisters who they do not know, who they have no quarrel with, only because their god emperor, their king, their ruler, their president, whoever it was, said you have to. They are bad people, which I kind of vibe with. Only on a most superficial view can the killing of these men seem a means of saving the nations from oppression and from wars destructive of human life. One only need remember that similar oppression and similar war went on no matter who was at the head of the government. Nicholas or Alexander, Frederick or Wilhelm, Napoleon or Louis, Palmerston or Gladstone, McKinley or anyone else, in order to understand that it is not any particular person who causes these oppressions and these wars from which the nations suffer. The misery of nations is caused not by particular persons, but by the particular order of society under which the people are so tied up together that they find themselves all in the power of a few men, or more often in the power of one single man. A man so perverted by his unnatural position as arbiter of the fate and lives of millions that he is always in an unhealthy state, and always suffers more or less from a mania of self-aggrandizement, which only his exceptional position conceals from general notice. Whoa, I love this one because this is a fact that we have stated about presidents term after term, right? Every time a president goes in and comes out, we go, they look like death. They look like they aged 30, 40, 50 years, right? Obama, Bush, Biden, obviously. It's a known thing, and he says it right here too. I'll go back here. Or more often in the power of one single man, a man so perverted by his unnatural position as arbiter of the fate and lives of millions that he is always in an unhealthy state and always suffers more or less from a mania of self-aggrandizement, I'm probably putting the emphasis in the wrong place, which only his exceptional position conceals from general notice. Incredible. Because of their position as president, as ruler, as whatever, you don't realize it in the moment, right? That's your president. It is your duty to acknowledge and respect, the president of the United States. You have to accept he is your president now, regardless of the results of the election. But as soon as he's out, as soon as it's done, it goes, wow, he looks like shit. That job is terrible. Look how sick it made him look. I fucking love that. Carrying on, though. Apart from the fact that such men are surrounded from earliest childhood to the grave by the most insensate luxury and an atmosphere of falsehood and flattery which always accompanies them, their whole education and all their occupations are centered on one object: learning about former murders, the best present-day ways of murdering, and the best preparations for future murder. From childhood, they learn about killing in all its possible forms. They carry about this with them murderous weapons, sword or sabers. They dress themselves in various uniforms. They attend parades, reviews, and maneuvers. They visit one another, presenting one another with orders and nominating one another to the command of regiments. And not only does no one tell them plainly what they are doing or say that to busy oneself with preparations for killing is revolting and criminal, but from all sides they hear nothing but approval and enthusiasm for all this activity of theirs. Every time they go out, and at each parade and review, crowds of people flock to greet them with enthusiasm, and it seems to them as if the whole nation approves of their conduct. The only part of the press that reaches them and that seems to them the expression of the feelings of the whole people, or at least of its best representatives, most slavishly extols their every word and action, however silly or wicked it may be. Those around them, men and women, clergy and laity, all people who do not prize human dignity, vying with one another in refined flattery, agree with them about anything and deceive them about everything, making it impossible for them to see life as it is. Such rulers might live 100 years without ever seeing one single really independent man or ever hearing the truth spoken. One is sometimes appalled to hear the words and deeds of these men, but one need only consider their position in order to understand that anyone in their place would act as they do. If a reasonable man found himself in their place, there's only one reasonable action he could perform, and that would be able to get away from such a position. Anyone remaining in it would behave as they do. So, it is not the Alexanders and Humberts, nor the Wilhelms, Nicholases, and Chamberlains, though they decree these oppressions of the nations and these wars, who are really the most guilty of these sins, but it is rather those who place and support them in the position of arbiters over the lives of their fellow men, and therefore the thing to do is to not kill Alexanders, Nicholases, Wilhelms, and Humberts, but to cease to support the arrangement of society of which they are a result. And what supports the present order of society is the selfishness and stupefaction of the people, who sell their freedom and honor for insignificant material advantages. People who stand on the lowest rung of the ladder, partly as a result of being stupefied by a patriotic and pseudo-religious education, and partly for the sake of personal advantages, cede their freedom and sense of human dignity at the bidding of those who stand above them and offer them material advantages. In the same way, in consequence of stupefaction and chiefly for the sake of advantages, those who are a little higher up on the ladder cede their freedom and manly dignity, and the same thing repeats itself with those standing yet higher, and so on to the topmost rung, to those who, or to him who, standing at the apex of the social cone, have nothing more to obtain, for whom the only motives of action are love, power, and vanity, and who are generally so perverted and stupefied by the power of life and death which they hold over their fellow men, and by the consequent servility and flattery of those who surround them, that without ceasing to do evil, they feel quite assured that they are benefactors to the human race. It is the people who sacrifice their dignity as men for material profit that produce these men who cannot act otherwise than as they do act, and with whom it is useless to be angry for their stupid and wicked actions. To kill such men is like whipping children, whom one has first spoiled. That nations should not be oppressed, and that there should be none of these useless wars, and that men may not be indignant of those who seem to cause these evils, and may not kill them, it seems that only a very small thing is necessary. It is necessary that men should understand things as they are, should call them by their right names, and should know that an army is an instrument for killing, and that enrollment and management of an army, the very things which kings, emperors, and presidents occupy themselves with so self-confidently, is a preparation for murder. If only king, emperor, and president understood that his work of directing armies is not an honorable and important duty, as his flatterers persuade him that it is, but a bad and shameful act of preparation for murder, and if each private individual stood up that the payment of taxes wherewith to hire and equip soldiers, and above all military service itself, are not matters of indifference, but are bad and shameful actions by which he not only permits but participates in murder, then this power of emperors, kings, and presidents, which now arouses our indignation, and which causes them to be murdered, would disappear of itself. So, the Alexanders, the Carnets, the Humberts, and others should not be murdered, but it should be explained to them that they are themselves murderers, and chiefly, they should not be allowed to kill people. Men should refuse to murder at their command. If the people do not yet act in this way, it is only because governments, to maintain themselves, diligently exercise a hypnotic influence upon the people, and therefore we may help to prevent people killing either kings or one another, not by killing. Murder only increases the hypnotism, but by arousing people from their hypnotic condition. And it is this I have tried to do by these remarks. So don't kill. It's bad, even though he can understand the reason for political violence. It's human. It at least makes sense in that regard. It won't do anything, right? And I think this one, a lot of people struggle with this one, right? I think through patriotism, through the fear that we have of other nations, we feel that there's a great need in military. However, going back to the point that we don't hate anyone in any country. I can't point to a single individual in Russia, in China, in Palestine, in Iran, in Israel, in the Ukraine, whatever, that I hate. I hate their governments, and their government hates ours, but in no way does it make sense for me to go over there and kill somebody who doesn't know me and that I don't know at the command of somebody who will never have my back, who will never go to war, and and after which I go and slaughter for, will still expect me to pay his salary if I'm lucky enough to come back alive, no matter what physical or mental or spiritual scars I may have from battle. And that's a hard thing, I think, for a lot of people to sort of get over, right? And that's not me discrediting or being unthankful for people who have served. Obviously, they have made the ultimate sacrifice. And that does need and deserve to be respected, the individual. So like this is obviously, the time where we do honor our veterans, and I do honor my veterans. I think that the sacrifice that they gave, it's noteworthy. I'm not going to sit there and go, you murderer, you do this, that, like they, knowingly or not, they gave up quite a lot. They risked quite a lot. I'm not sucking off the military industrial complex. I'm not sucking off any branch of the military, but I'm going to honor and respect those who did sacrifice themselves. But going for those who haven't, for those who ask, for those who are interested, I think it does, only benefit us to say, don't do that. Don't go in. Don't become even more of a slave to the state to sort of further their power and their reach. You as a human being, obviously, are worth more than that. And that's just sort of the way I would spin it, rather than trying to use it as a tear down the state sort of thing. There's so much more to life than that. We already are slaves, right? And I'm not saying by not joining the military, you're going to be an absolutely free man, but it's a way to sort of further remove yourself from slavery or lessen the weight of your shackles. And he gets into that a little later here. And if you can do that, why not? And it's that hypnotism that he talks about too, why people feel like we need a military industrial complex, right? Well, China's going to nuke us. Russia's going to nuke us. We need to have the biggest, the baddest killing force. We got to go over there. We got to kill them first. And that, furthermore, people feeling such a sense of purpose by joining, by being hypnotized with the parades, the uniforms, the discipline that really sort of breaks you down from your individuality to sort of be just a killing puppet for the state. All of that sort of works together to sort of prop it all up. So I thought that was a very cool way of sort of putting that into perspective and wording it. I also liked his blurb about, while I can understand why you took that king's head off, it's not really the right thing to do. And because it doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't really matter who's on the throne. Like I said, another one's going to pop right up and the same thing is going to happen. Just how nobody's been on the throne for several months now and nothing's changed. But anyways, let's see. Where do I want to go next? The Slavery of Our Times, obviously written by Leo Tolstoy from the year 1900. And I'm going to read, how many pages of this? I'm going to read a few. This is about work, I believe. Do I want to read this? Let me see. I may skip this part. No, I feel this is important. Okay. The Slavery of Our Times, 1900. An acquaintance of mine who serves on the Moscow-Kursk Railway as a weigher in the course of conversation mentioned to me that the men who load the goods onto the scales work for 36 hours on end. Though I had full confidence in the speaker's truthfulness, I was unable to believe him. I thought he was making a mistake or exaggerating or that I misunderstood something. But the weigher narrated the conditions under which his work is done so exactly that there was no room left for doubt. He told me that there are 250 such goods porters at the Kursk station in Moscow. They were all divided into gangs of 5 men and were on piecework, receiving from 1 ruble, say 2 shillings, to 1 ruble 15 kopecks for every 1,000 poods, over 16 tons, of goods received or dispatched. Okay. That was some Russian monopoly money nonsense. Let's break that down. Okay, so he said that there are 250 workers, or goods porters, at the Kursk station. They are divided into gangs of 5, and they receive 1 ruble or 2 shillings to 1 ruble 15 kopecks, or 1 ruble 15 cents, I guess, in Russian monopoly money, for every 1,000 poods, Poods, which is a measurement of over 16 tons. This is just made up, of goods received or dispatched. So every 16 tons you measure or weigh as a worker here, you're paid 2 shillings, essentially. And they work 36 hours. Got it. They come in the morning, work all day and all night at unloading the trucks, and when the night is ended, they again begin to reload and then work on for another day, so that in 2 days they get 1 night's sleep. Their work consists of unloading and moving bales of 7, 8, and up to 10 poods, say 18, 20, and up to nearly 26 stone. So, every 1,000 poods, so over 6, after you reach 16 tons, you get 2 shillings. So their work, after 2 days' work, essentially, consists of unloading and moving bales of 7, 8, and up to 10 poods. Got it. So that's 18, 20, and up to nearly 26 stone. 2 men place the bales on the backs of the other 3 who carry them. By such work, they earn less than a ruble a day. They work continually without holidays. The account given by the weigher was so circumstantial that it was impossible to doubt it, but nevertheless I decided to verify it with my own eyes, and I went to the goods station. Finding my acquaintance at the goods station, I told him I had come to see what he had told me about. No one I mentioned to believes it, I told him. Without replying, the weigher called to someone in a shed. Nikita, come here. From the door appeared a tall, lean workman in a torn coat. When did you begin work? When? Yesterday morning. And where were you last night? I was unloading, of course. Did you work during the night? I asked. Of course I worked. And when did you begin work today? We began in the morning. When else should we begin? And when will you finish working? When they let us go, then we finish. The other 4 workmen of his gang came up to us. They all wore torn coats and were without overcoats, though the temperature was about 13 degrees Fahrenheit below 0. Oh, Russia. I began to ask them about the conditions of their work and evidently surprised them by taking an interest in such a simple and natural thing as their 36-hour work. They were all villagers, for the most part, fellow countrymen of my own, from Tula. Some, however, were from Oriol, and some others from Voronezh. They lived in Moscow in lodgings, some of them with their families, but most of them without. Those who have come here alone send their earnings home to the village. They board with contractors. Their food costs them 10 rubles a month. They always eat meat, disregarding the fasts. Their work always keeps them occupied more than 36 hours running because it takes more than half an hour to get to and from their lodgings, and besides, they are often kept at work beyond the time fixed. Paying for their own food, they earn by such 37-hour continuous work about 25 rubles a month. Lovely. To my question why they did such convict work, they replied, "Where is one to go? But why work 36 hours on end? Cannot the work be arranged in shifts?" "We do what we're told to." "Yes, but why do you agree to it?" "We agree because we have to feed ourselves. If you don't like it, be off. If you're even an hour late, you have your ticket thrown at you and given your marching orders, and there are 10 men ready to take the place." The men were all young. Only one was somewhat older, perhaps about 40. All their faces were lean and had exhausted, weary eyes, as though the men were drunk. The lean workman, to whom I first spoke, struck me especially by the strange weariness of his look. I asked him whether he had been drinking today. "I don't drink," he answered, in the decided way in which men who really do not drink always reply to that question. I'm sure you're familiar with that in Russia. "And I do not smoke," he added. "Do the others drink?" I asked. "Yes, it's brought here. The work is not light, and a drink always adds to one's strength," said the older workman. This man had been drinking that day, but it was not in the least noticeable. After some more talk with the workmen, I went to watch the work. Passing long rows of all sorts of goods, I came to some workmen slowly pushing a loaded truck. I learned afterwards that the men have to shunt the trucks themselves and to keep the platform clear of snow without being paid for the work. It is so stated in the quote-unquote conditions of pay. There, workmen were just as tattered as those with whom I had been talking. When they had moved the truck to its place, I went up to them and asked when they began to work and when they had dined. I was told that they started work at 7 o'clock, had only just dined. The work had prevented their being let off sooner. "And when do you get away?" "As it happens, sometimes not till 10 o'clock, replied the men, as if boasting of their endurance. We all know those fucking workaholics. Seeing my interest in their position, they surrounded me, and probably taking me for an inspector, several of them speaking at once informed me of what was evidently their chief subject of complaint, namely, that the apartment in which they could sometimes warm themselves and snatch an hour's sleep between the day work and the night work was crowded. All of them expressed great dissatisfaction at this crowding. There may be 100 men and nowhere to lie down. Even under the shelves it is crowded, said dissatisfied voices. Have a look at it yourself. It is close by here. The room was certainly not large enough. In the 36-foot room, about 40 men might find place to lie down on the shelves. Some of the men entered the room with me, and they vied with each other in complaining of the scantiness of the accommodation. Even under the shelves there is nowhere to lie down, they said. These men, who in 13 degrees of frost without overcoats carry on their backs 20-stone loads during 36 hours, who dine and sup not when they need food, but when their overseer allows them to eat, who live together in conditions far worse than dray horses, it seems strange that these people only complained of insufficient accommodation in the room where they warmed themselves. But though this seemed strange to me at first, yet entering further into the position, I understood what a feeling of torture these men, who never get enough sleep, and who are half frozen, must experience when instead of resting and being warmed, they have to sleep on the dirty floor under the shelves, and there in stuffy and vitiated air become yet weaker and more broken down. Only perhaps in that miserable hour of vain attempt to get rest and sleep do they painfully realize all the horror of their life-destroying 36-hour work, and that it is why they are specially agitated by such an apparently insignificant circumstance as the overcrowding of their room. Having watched several gangs at work and having talked with more of the men, and heard the same story from them all, I drove home, convinced that what my acquaintance had told me was true, that for a bare subsistence, people, considering themselves free men, thought it necessary to give themselves up to work such as, in these days of serfdom, not one slave owner, however cruel, would have sent his slaves to, let alone slave owners, not one cab proprietor would send his horses to such work, for horses cost money, and it would be wasteful by excessive work to shorten the life of an animal of value. I do like that blurb, right? Because sometimes we are, as people, so blinded by what's happening, and we are so hypnotized by just the condition of things and of the state that we zero in on seemingly insignificant things. For example, I think election topics are very important, right? Like this year, abortion was the big one, right? Forget the fact that potential 2 nuclear wars are about to kick off with a third starting to brew up. Forget the fact that, there's an entire class of people who may never be able to own a house. Forget the fact that everything's harder to afford. It's very hard to eat healthy foods and clean foods. All of the water supplies are being contaminated, and everyone's ingesting metals and plastic and getting cancer and other debilitating diseases at an exponential rate. While there are 450 government agencies some of which are designed to keep us healthy, only seem to make us more sick as more agencies are created. But no, we need to be able to have an abortion. That is the only thing that matters. And I have stated my opinion on that. I draw the similarities to gun rights. I'm not getting into that now, but it just speaks to your situation could be so bad. It could be so ugly and so hopeless. But because you're so caught up in the shit of things and you don't have that perspective, you latch onto one little thing that's not going to really change anything for you. It's not going to make anything better, really. You're still going to be just as at risk. You're still going to be just as unhealthy. Things are still going to be just as unaffordable, but you're going to have this one little breadcrumb, right? In this case, it's the overcrowding in the dorm rooms where you're not going to be able to sleep for more than an hour before you're drawn back to work for another 36 to make 2 shillings a day. It's not that. Nothing's going to change about your work. The work is still going to be shit. You're still going to be abused. You're still going to be paid like shit. But you'll be a little less crowded in the freezing dorm room where you can try to sleep. Vote for me sort of thing. I like that a lot. I thought that was very, very telling and a great parable for that. I'm going to carry on, I think, on this essay, I think, for one more section here before moving on to the next one. To oblige men to work for 37 hours continuously without sleep, besides being cruel, is also uneconomical, and yet such uneconomical expenditure of human lives continually goes on around us. Opposite the house in which I live is a silk factory, built with the latest technical improvements. About 3,000 women and 700 men work and live there. As I sit in my room now, I hear the unceasing din of machinery and know, for I have been there, what that din means. 3,000 women stand, for 12 hours a day, at the looms, amid a deafening roar, winding and unwinding, arranging the silk threads to make silk stuffs. All the women, except those who have just come from the village, have an unhealthy appearance. Most of them lead a most intemperate and immoral life. Almost all, whether married or unmarried, as soon as a child is born to them, send it off either to the village or to the foundlings' hospital, where 80% of these children perish. For fear of losing their places, the mothers resume work the next day, or on the third day after their confinement. For 20 years, to my knowledge, tens of thousands of young, healthy women, mothers, have ruined and are now ruining their lives and the lives of their children in order to produce velvets and silk stuffs. I met a beggar yesterday, a young man who crutches, sturdily built, but crippled. A young man on crutches, sturdily built, but crippled. Some of this text is a little faded. He used to work as a navvy with a wheelbarrow, but slipped and injured himself internally. He spent all that he had on peasant women healers and on doctors, and has now for 8 years been homeless, begging his bread and complaining that God does not send him death. How many such sacrifices of life there are that we either know nothing of or know of, but hardly notice, considering them inevitable. I know men working at the blast furnaces of the Tula Iron Factory who have one Sunday free each fortnight, will work for 24 hours, that is, after working all day, they will go on working all night. I have seen these men. They all drink vodka to keep up their energy, and obviously, like those goods porters on the railway, they quickly expend not the interest, but the capital of their lives. And what of the waste of lives among those who are employed on admittedly harmful work, in looking-glass, card, match, sugar, tobacco, and glass factories, in mines, or as cesspool cleaners? There are English statistics showing that the average length of life among people of the upper classes is 55 years, and the average life among working people in unhealthy occupations is 29 years. Knowing this, and we cannot help knowing it, we, who take advantage of labor that thus costs human lives, should, one would think, unless we are beasts, not be able to enjoy a moment's peace. But the fact is that we, well-to-do people, liberals and humanitarians, very sensitive to the sufferings not only of people but also of animals, unceasingly make use of such labor, and try to become more and more rich, that is, to take still greater advantage of such work, and we remain perfectly tranquil. For instance, having learned of the 37-hour labor of the goods porters and of their bad room, we at once send there an inspector, who receives a good salary, and we forbid people to work more than 12 hours, leaving the workmen, who are thus deprived 1/3 of their earnings, to feed themselves as best they can, and we compel the railway company to erect a large and convenient room for the workmen. Then, with perfectly quiet consciences, we continue to receive and dispatch goods by that railway, and we ourselves continue to receive salaries, dividends, and rents from houses or land. Having learned that the women and girls at the silk factory living far from their families ruin their own lives and those of their children, and that well over half of the washerwomen who iron our starched shirts, and of the type settlers who print the books and papers that while away our time get tuberculosis, we only shrug our shoulders and say that we are very sorry things should be so, but that we can do nothing to alter it. And we continue with tranquil conscience to buy silk stuffs, to wear starched shirts, and to read our morning paper. We are much concerned about the hours of the shop assistants, and still more about the long hours of our children at school. We strictly forbid carters to make their horses drag heavy loads, and we even organize the killing of cattle in slaughterhouses so that the animals may feel it as little as possible. But how wonderfully blind we have become as soon as the question concerns those millions of workers who perish slowly and often painfully all around us at labors whose fruits we use for our convenience and pleasure. I think the parable there is always going to be freedom is greater than comfort. Again, back to a pillar. Regardless of how convenient and safe and pleasurable things feel in this system, under this government, under the current state of things, it will never supersede your freedom. And Tolstoy takes that a step further, because should you continue to support this machine, which he views as evil and immoral, you're standing up not only murders, but also this terrible exploitation of people as well, furthering his stance that it's immoral to do so and to reject it and to vote, not necessarily by ballot, but with your money, by moving somewhere else, by doing something different, by taking real actions. But we don't, for whatever reason. Maybe we do find find it too convenient, too pleasurable to take advantage of these great things that exploit human capital and other sort of terrible atrocities, mainly because maybe we might like it too much, or we just feel like it's, it doesn't really matter if I, go support a small business down the street. I'm just going to buy it off Amazon. I know I'm going to get it same day or next day because of Prime. That sort of mentality. It's just one transaction. It's a splash in the bucket. It's not really going to make much of a difference. So sucks to suck, but I'm going to do this anyways. That sort of thing. So freedom, always greater than comfort, I think is the parable behind that one, I would say. Let's see. How long is this next one I want to jump to? 128. I hope all this makes sense. This is not the way I really want to start my morning. This is a lot of reading. All right, moving on. I'm reading a paragraph or a section from his work, The Slavery of Our Times, from 1900 as well. He was busy in the year 1900, it would seem. This is section 7, labeled Culture and Freedom. It's a very long essay or paper that he wrote here. But here we go. Just what happened when serfdom existed is now being repeated. Then, the majority of serf owners and of the people of the well-to-do classes, if they acknowledged serfs' position to not be quite satisfactory, yet recommended only such alterations as would not deprive the owners of what was essential to their profit. Now, people of the well-to-do classes, admitting that the position of the workers is not altogether satisfactory, propose for its amendment only such measures as will not deprive the well-to-do classes of their advantages. As well-disposed owners then spoke of paternal authority, and like Gogol, that's a name, advised owners to be kind to their serfs and to take care of them, but would not tolerate the idea of emancipation, considering it harmful and dangerous. Just so the majority of well-to-do people advise employers to look after the well-being of their workpeople, but do not admit the thought of any such alteration to the economic structure of life as would set the laborers quite free. And just as advanced liberals then, while considering serfdom to be an immutable arrangement, demanded that the government should limit the power of the owners and sympathized with the serfs' agitation. So the liberals of today, while considering the existing order immutable, demand that government should limit the powers of capitalists and manufacturers, and they sympathize with unions and strikes, and in general with the workers' agitation. Just as the most advanced men then demanded the emancipation of the serfs, but drew up a project which left the serfs dependent on private landowners or fettered them with tributes and land taxes, so now the most advanced people demand the emancipation of workmen from the power of the capitalists and the communalization of the means of production, but yet would leave the workers dependent on the present apportionment and division of labor, which, in their opinion, must remain unaltered. The teachings of economic science, which are adopted, though without close examination of their details, by all those of the well-to-do classes who consider themselves enlightened and advanced, seem on a superficial examination to be liberal and even radical, containing as they do attacks on the wealthy classes of society, but essentially that teaching is in the highest degree conservative, gross, and cruel. One way or another, the men of science, and in their train all the well-to-do classes, wish at all costs to maintain the present system of distribution and division of labor, which makes possible the production of that great quantity of goods which they use. The existing economic order is called culture by the men of science, and, following them, by all the well-to-do classes, and in this culture, in its railways, telegraphs, telephones, photographs, Röntgenrays, clinical hospitals, exhibitions, and chiefly in all the appliances of comfort, they see something so sacrosanct that they will not allow even a thought of alterations which might destroy it, or but endanger a small part of these acquisitions. Everything may, according to the teaching of that science, be changed except what it calls culture. It becomes more and more evident that this culture can only exist while the workers are compelled to work. Yet men of science are so sure that this culture is the greatest of blessings that they boldly proclaim the contrary of what the purists once said, fiat justitia pereat mundus. They now say fiat cultura pereat justitia. All right, and I have the translations for that in front of me. All right, with the translations now. So, rewinding that, yet men of science are so sure that this culture is the greatest of blessings that they boldly proclaim the contrary of what the purists once said, fiat justitia pereat mundus. I hope I said that right. But that simply means, let justice be done though the world perish. They now say, fiat cultura pereat justitia, which means, let culture be preserved though justice perish. They not only say it, but act on it. Excuse me. Everything may be changed in practice and in theory, except culture, except all that is going on in workshops and factories, and especially what is being sold in the shops. But I think that enlightened people, professing the Christian law of brotherhood and love to one's neighbor, should say just the contrary. Electric lights and telephones and exhibitions are excellent, and so are all the pleasure gardens and concerts and performances, and all the cigars and matchboxes, braces, and motor cars. But may they all go to perdition, and not they alone, but the railways and all the factory-made chintz stuffs and cloths in the world. If to produce them it is necessary that 99% of the people should remain in slavery and perish by thousands in factories needed for the production of these articles. If in order that London or Petersburg may be lit by electricity, or in order to construct exhibition buildings, or in order that there may be beautiful paints, or in order to weave beautiful cloths quickly and abundantly, it is necessary that even a very few lives should be destroyed, or ruined, or shortened. The statistics show us how many are destroyed. Let London and Petersburg rather be lit by gas or oil. Let there rather be no exhibition, no paints or materials. Let there be no slavery and no destruction of human lives resulting from it. The motto for truly enlightened people is not fiat cultura pereat justitia, but fiat justitia pereat cultura. And reading that again with the translations. So the motto for truly enlightened people is not let culture be preserved, though justice perish, but let justice be done, though the world perish. No, though culture perish, he says here. So, one more time. The motto for truly enlightened people is not let culture be preserved, though justice perish, but let justice be done, though culture perish. Fire. But culture, useful culture, will not be destroyed. It will certainly not be necessary for people to revert to tillage of the land with sticks or to lighting up with torches. It is not for nothing that mankind in its slavery has achieved such great progress in technical matters, if not only it is understood that we must not sacrifice the lives of our brother men for our own pleasure, it will be possible to apply the technical improvements without destroying men's lives, and to arrange life so as to profit by all those methods giving us control of nature that have been devised and that can be applied without keeping our brother men in slavery. I like the end of that a lot. So, order of things obviously pretty cruel, the working conditions of all of us and whatnot. The end, though, he goes into, it would be silly to assume that if we were to do away with culture, to do away with the system of things, that we would simply revert back to poking dirt with sticks and living as peasants or serfs again, rather than taking full advantage of the advancements that we have made, but to use them in a more natural and in a more moral sense. And we see this argument a lot when we get pushed back on, well, without the government, who's going to pave the roads? Oh, without the government, what about this, that, and the other thing? Well, I hate to break it to you, but we've had roads, we've had schools, we've had business, we've had courts, we've had systems of law, we've had everything basically that we accredit the government with now, well before governments ever existed. And he takes that a step further. He's like, not only will we have that, but we'll be able to take advantage of all the achievements that we have sort of come across as humanity. But we'll be able to do it in a more enlightened sense, right? In a more natural sense. And it will be sort of less outsourced to the government and to the corporations that sort of support and feed the government. It'll be a little more sort for the people because it's not for the government at that point. But that's my favorite one, without the government, we're just going to dissolve and just turn into just fire and crime and just, like the dark ages. No, that's silly. People have had utilities and all of that well before government. Yes, it'll probably be a little rough figuring it out about the upkeep and whatnot. But if we need that stuff, which I do believe that we do at this point, it'd be silly to assume that they won't be upkept and that people won't do it and that the people won't pay people to do it. Properly, and it'll be done even better since it's not going to go to some government bidding sort of system of work and whatnot, especially with roads. So yeah, that's why I really enjoyed that little quick segment. But chugging right along, let's see what's next here. Let's get into some taxes. And this is just me jumping around. I really have no set order of this. This is just in I guess the order in which I've read this book through. I sort of took notes as I went along, which portions I want to read. Only got a couple more left, not too much. I know it's going to be a long one here. 134 to 135. So we're still on the same essay, the same work here. We're just in a different section. So this is still The Slavery of Our Times, written in 1900. From Section 10, Laws Concerning Taxes, Land, and Property. I want to read from... I guess we'll start from the top. Why not, of 134. It's not the beginning of the section. It's sort of halfway through. I'm going to probably read the rest of it, I think is what I wanted to when I made that note. About taxes, it is said that people ought to pay them because they are instituted with the general, even though silent consent of all, and are used for public needs to the advantage of all. Is this true? The answer to this question is given in history and in present-day facts. History shows that taxes never were instituted by common consent, but, on the contrary, always in consequence of the fact that some people, having obtained power over other people by conquest or by other means, imposed tribute, not for public needs, but for themselves. And the same thing is still going on. Taxes are taken by those who have the power to take them. If nowadays some portion of these tributes, called taxes and duties, is used for public purposes, it is for the most part for public purposes that are harmful rather than useful to most people. For instance, in Russia, 1/3 of the peasants' whole income is taken in taxes, but only 1/15 of the state revenue is spent on their greatest need, the education of the people. And even that amount is spent on a kind of education which, by stupefying the people, harms them even more than it benefits them. The other 49/50ths are spent on unnecessary things harmful to the people, such as equipping the army, building strategic railways, forts, and prisons, or supporting the priesthood or the court, and on salaries for those people who make it possible to take this money from the people. The same thing goes on not only in Persia, Turkey, and India, but also in all the Christian and constitutional states and democratic republics. Money is taken from the majority of people, but independently of the consent or non-consent of the payers, and the amount collected is not what is really needful, but as much as can be got. We know how parliaments are made up, and how little they respect the will of the people, and it is used not for the common advantage, but for things the governing classes consider necessary for themselves, on wars in Cuba or the Philippines, on taking and keeping the riches of the Transvaal, and so forth. So, the explanation that people must pay taxes because they are instituted with general consent and are used for the common good is as untrue as the other explanation that private property in land is established to encourage agriculture. What is this word Transvaal? Transvaal. Let me look that up. Historical geographic region in South Africa. Got it. Okay. So cool. A little nod then that taxes don't go towards those great things that we all attribute the government to really providing for us. And if they do, it's not nearly enough, or it goes towards some half-ass attempt that will never truly satisfy or really benefit society, i.e. education. We all know public education's a fucking joke. We all know the roads are a fucking joke. We all know the infrastructure's a fucking joke. So cool to see a little nod to that back in the year 1900. What's next? We hit taxes. Let's get into some of the slavery quotes here, because I really vibe with this. We're still in the same one, same essay here. Section 11, Laws, the Cause of Slavery. And this section, I will say, really vibes with me because over the past several years, I've noticed, I was lucky enough to be born a human being with individual natural rights, which put us above all other sort of things on this earth. We are incredible beings, we are very unique, each and every one of us. We're all very special, and we are paying taxes and submitting to lesser, dumber, slower, unqualified people. And that's what sort of drives a lot of what I do here and a lot of what I do in my normal life. Like, I want to live my life to the fullest. I want to be everything that I was intended to be and everything that I intend to do, obviously in a moral and just manner. But I see the government really fucking with that in, quite many ways. And I feel like this sort of helps put that into a little bit of perspective as well. Section 11, Laws, the Cause of Slavery. The slavery of our times results from three sets of laws, those about land, taxes, and property, and therefore all the attempts of those who wish to improve the position of the workers are inevitably, though unconsciously, directed against those three legislations. One set of people would repeal taxes, weighing on the working classes, and transfer them on to the rich. Others propose to abolish the right of private property in land, and attempts are being made to put this in practice in both New Zealand and in one of the American states. The limitations of landlords' rights in Ireland is a move in the same direction. A third set, the socialists propose to communalize the means of production, to tax incomes and inheritances, and to limit the rights of capitalist employers. It would therefore seem as though the legislative enactments which caused slavery were being repealed, and that we may therefore expect slavery to be abolished in this way. But we need only to look more closely at the conditions under which the abolition of these legislative enactments is accomplished or proposed to be convinced that not only the practical, but even the theoretical projects for the improvement of the worker's position are merely replacing one legislation producing slavery by another producing a newer form of slavery. Thus, for instance, those who abolish taxes and duties for the poor, first abolishing direct dues, then transferring the burden of taxation from the poor to the rich, necessarily have to retain and do retain the law creating private property of land, of the means of production, and of other articles onto which the whole burden of taxes is shifted. The retention of the law concerning land and property keeps the workers in slavery to the landowners and the capitalists, even though the workers are freed from taxes. Those who, like Henry George and his supporters, would abolish the laws creating private property of land, propose new laws imposing an obligatory rent on the land, and this obligatory land rent will necessarily create a new form of slavery, because a man compelled to pay rent or a single tax may at any failure of the crops or other misfortune have to borrow money from a man who has some to lend, and will again lapse into slavery. Those who, like the socialists, who want to abolish the legislation of property in land and in means of production, not only retain the legislation of taxes, but must moreover inevitably introduce laws of compulsory labor. That is, they must reestablish slavery in its primitive form. Super cool to see him shitting on socialists still. So, this way or that, all the practical and theoretical repeals of certain laws maintaining slavery in one form have always replaced it by new legislation creating slavery in another and fresh form. What happens is something like what a jailer might do who shifted a prisoner's chains from his neck to the arms, and from the arms to the legs, or took them off and substituted the bolts and bars. All the improvements that have hitherto taken place in the position of the workers have been of this kind. The laws giving a master the right to compel his slaves to do compulsory work were replaced by laws allowing the masters to own all the land. The laws allowing the land to become the private property of the masters may be replaced by taxation laws, the control of the taxes being in the hands of the masters. The taxation laws may be replaced by others defending the right of private property in articles of use and in the means of production. The laws maintaining property in land and in articles of use and means of production may, as is now proposed, be replaced by the enactment of compulsory labor. So, it is evident that the abolition of one form of legislation producing the slavery of our time, whether taxes or land ownership, or property in articles of use or in the means of production, will not destroy slavery, but will only repeal one of its forms, which will immediately be replaced by a new one, as was the case with the abolition of chattel slavery and of serfdom, and with the repeals of taxes. Even the abolition of all three groups of law together will not abolish slavery, but evoke a new and previously unknown form of it, which is now already beginning to show itself and to shackle the freedom of labor by legislation concerning the hours of work, the age and state of health of the workers, as well as by demanding obligatory attendance at schools, by delusions for old age insurance or accidents, by all the measures of factory inspection, etc. All this is nothing but transitional legislation preparing a new and as yet untried form of slavery. So, it becomes evident that the essence of slavery lies not in those three roots of legislation on which it now rests, and not even in this or that legislative enactment, but in the fact that legislation exists, that there are people who have power to decree laws profitable for themselves, and as long as people have that power, there will be slavery. Formerly, it was profitable for people to have chattel slaves, and they made laws about chattel slavery. Afterwards, it became profitable to own land and to take taxes and to keep things one had acquired, and they made laws correspondingly. Now it is profitable for people to maintain the existing direction and division of labor, and they are devising such laws as will compel people to work under the present apportionment, and division of labor. Thus, the fundamental cause of slavery is legislation. The fact that there are people who have the power to make laws. What is legislation, and what gives people the power to make laws? There exists a whole science, even more ancient, mendacious, and confused than political economy, the servants of which in the course of centuries have written millions of books, for the most part contradicting one another, to answer these questions. The aim of this science, as of political economy, is not to explain what now exists and what ought to be, but rather to prove that what now exists is what ought to be. So it happens that in this science of jurisprudence, we find very many dissertations about rights, about object and subject, about the idea of a state, and other such matters which are unintelligible both to the students and to the teachers of this science, but we get no clear reply to the question, what is legislation? According to science, legislation is the expression of the will of the whole people. But as those who break laws, or who wish to break them, and only refrain from doing so through fear of being punished, are always more numerous than those who wish to carry out the code, it is evident that legislation can certainly not be considered as the expression of the will of the whole people. For instance, there are laws about not damaging telegraph posts, about showing respect to certain people, about each man performing military service or serving as a juryman, about not taking certain goods beyond a certain frontier, or about not using land considered to be the property of someone else, about not making money tokens, not using articles which are considered to be the property of others, and about many other matters. All these laws and many others are extremely complex and may have been passed from the most diverse motives, but not one of them expresses the will of the whole people. There is but one characteristic common to all these laws, though, namely, that if any man does not fulfill them, those who have made these laws will send armed men, and the armed men will beat, deprive of freedom, or even kill the man who does not obey the law. If a man does not wish to give, as taxes, such part of the produce of his labor as is demanded of him, armed men will come and take from him what is demanded. And if he resists, he'll be beaten, deprived of freedom, and sometimes even killed. The same will happen to a man who begins to make use of land considered to be the property of another. The same will happen to a man who makes use of things he wants to satisfy his requirements or to facilitate his work. If these things are considered to be the property of someone else, armed men will come and will deprive him of what he has taken, and if he resists, they will beat him, deprive him of liberty, or even kill him. The same thing will happen to anyone who will not show respect to those whom it is decreed that we are to respect, and to who will not obey the demand that he should go on as a soldier, or who makes money tokens. For every non-fulfillment of the established laws, there is punishment. The offender is subjected by those who make the laws to blows, imprisonment, or even loss of life. Many constitutions have been devised, beginning with the English and the American, and ending with the Japanese and the Turkish, according to which people are to believe that all laws established in their country are established at their desire. But everyone knows that not only in despotic countries, but also in countries nominally most free, England, America, France, and others, the laws are made not by the will of all, but by the will of those who have power, and therefore always and everywhere are such as are profitable to those who have power, be they many or few, or only one man. Everywhere and always the laws are enforced by only the means that has compelled and still compels some people to obey the will of others, by blows, deprivation of liberty, and by murder. There can be no other way. It cannot be otherwise, for laws are demands to obey certain rules, and to compel some people to obey certain rules can only be done by blows, by deprivation of liberty, and by murder. If there are laws, there must be the force that can compel people to obey them. There is only one force that can compel people to obey rules, to conform to the will of others, that is, and that is violence. Not the simple violence which people use on one another in moments of passion, but the organized violence used by people who have power in order to compel others to obey the laws that they, the powerful, have made. In other words, to do their will. The essence of legislature does not lie in subject or object, in rights, or in the idea of the dominion of the collective will of the people, or in other such indefinite and confused conditions, but lies in the fact that people, who wield organized violence, have power to compel others to obey them and do as they like. So the exact and irrefutable definition of legislation, intelligible to all, is that laws are rules, made by people who govern by means of organized violence, for non-compliance with which the non-complier is subjected to blows, to loss of liberty, or even being murdered. This definition furnishes the reply to the question, what is it that renders it possible for people to make laws? The same thing makes it possible to establish laws as enforces obedience to them, namely organized violence. All right, what's next after that? Shit, I think I went over a little bit, but okay. Laws, taxes, there. I've spoken about the monopoly on violence. Tolstoy basically calls it out. Here's the only way that they're able to do what they do. It sort of goes back to prove the point that there is still slavery here and you are still a slave so long as you are forced to pay taxes, and you are indeed forced, whether you go onto TurboTax willingly and file them. Everybody knows if you don't, you go straight to jail. Like, call it what it is, call things by their real names, as Tolstoy says. there you have it. I'm realizing I skipped over a portion I wanted to go over. Flipping back to 87 here, I believe. Let me make sure this is right. I believe this is from Patriotism and Government. Yes. So this part is from his essay, Patriotism and Government, written in 1900 again. To deliver men from the terrible and ever-increasing evils of armaments and war, we want neither congresses nor conferences, nor treaties nor courts of arbitration, but the destruction of those instruments of violence which are called governments, and from which humanity's greatest evils flow. To destroy government violence, only one thing is needed. It is that people should understand that the feeling of patriotism, which alone supports that instrument of violence, is a rude, harmful, disgraceful, and bad feeling, and above all, is immoral. It is a rude feeling because it is one natural only to people standing on the lowest level of morality and expecting from other nations such outrages as they themselves are ready to inflict. It is a harmful feeling because it disturbs advantageous and joyous peaceful relations with other peoples, and above all, produces that government organization under which power may fall, and does fall into the hands of the worst men. It is a disgraceful feeling because it turns man not merely into a slave, but into a fighting cock, a bull, or a gladiator, who wastes his strength and his life for objectives which are not his own, but his government's. And it is an immoral feeling, because instead of confessing oneself a son of God, as Christianity teaches us, or even a free man guided by his own reason, each man under the influence of patriotism confess himself the son of his fatherland and the slave of his government, and commits actions contrary to his reason and his conscience. It is only necessary that people should understand this, and the terrible bond called government by which we are chained together will fall to pieces of itself without struggle, and with it will cease the terrible and useless evils it produces. And people are already beginning to understand this. This, for instance, is what a citizen of the United States writes. We are farmers, mechanics, merchants, manufacturers, teachers, and all we ask is the privilege of attending to our own business. We own our homes, love our friends, are devoted to our families, and do not interfere with our neighbors. We have work to do and wish to work. Leave us alone. But they will not, these politicians. They insist on governing us and living off our labor. They tax us, eat our substance, conscript us, draft our boys into their wars. All the myriads of men who live off the government depend upon the government to tax us, and in order to tax us successfully, standing armies are maintained. The plea that the army is needed for the protection of the country is pure fraud and pretense. The French government frightens the people by telling them that the Germans are ready and anxious to fall upon them. The Russians fear the British fear anybody. That's good. And now in America, we are told we must increase our navy and add to our army because Europe may at any moment combine against us. This is fraud and untruth. The common people in France, Germany, England, and America are opposed to war. We only wish to be left alone. Men with wives, children, sweethearts, homes, aged parents do not want to go off and fight someone. We are peaceable, and we fear war. We hate it. We would like to obey the golden rule. War is the sure result of the existence of armed men. That country which maintains a large standing army will sooner or later have a war on hand. The man who prides himself on fisticuffs is going to some day meet a man who considers himself the better man, and they will fight. Germany and France have no issue save a desire to see which is the better man. They have fought many times, and they will fight again. Not that the people want to fight, but the superior class fan fright into fury and make men think they must go fight to protect their homes. So the people who wish to follow the teaching of Christ are not allowed to do so, but are taxed, outraged, deceived by governments. Christ taught humility, meekness, the forgiveness of one's enemies, and that to kill was wrong. The Bible teaches men not to swear oaths, but the superior class swear us in on the Bible in which they do not believe. The question is, how are we to relieve ourselves of these cormorants who toil not, but who are clothed in broadcloth and blue, with brass buttons and many costly accoutrements? Who feed upon our substance, and for whom we delve and dig? Shall we fight them? No. We do not believe in bloodshed, and besides that, they have the guns and the money, and they can hold out longer than we. But who composes this army that they would order to fire upon us? Why, our neighbors and brothers, deceived into the idea that they are doing God's service by protecting their country from its enemies. When the fact is, our country has no enemies save the superior class that pretends to look out for our interests if we only obey and consent to be taxed. Thus do they siphon our resources and turn our true brothers upon us to subdue and humiliate us. You cannot send a telegram to your wife, nor an express package to your friend, nor draw a check for your grocer until you first pay the tax to maintain armed men, who can quickly be used to kill you, and who surely will imprison you if you do not pay. The only relief lies in education. Educate men that it is wrong to kill. Teach them the golden rule, and yet again teach them the golden rule. Silently defy the superior class by refusing to bow down to their fetish of bullets. Cease supporting the preachers who cry for war and spout patriotism for a consideration. Let them go to work as we do. We believe in Christ, they do not. Christ spoke what he thought. They speak what they think will please the men in power, the superior class. We will not enlist. We will not shoot on their order. We will not charge bayonet upon a mild and gentle people. We will not fire upon shepherds and farmers fighting for their firesides upon a suggestion of Cecil Rhodes. Your false cry of wolf, wolf shall not alarm us. We pay your taxes only because we have to, and we will pay no longer than we have to. We will pay no rents, no tithes to your sham charities, and we will speak our minds upon occasion. We will educate men, and all the time our silent influence will be going out, and even the men who are conscripted will be half-hearted and refuse to fight. We will educate men into the thought that the Christ life of peace and goodwill is better than the life of strife, bloodshed, and war. Peace on earth. It can only come when men do away with armies and are willing to do unto other men as they would be done by. So writes a citizen of the United States, and from various sides in various forms such voices are sounding. People are beginning to understand the fraud of patriotism in which all governments take such pains to keep them involved. I do like that one. You can tell he gets a little fired up there. Jump ahead a few pages here to get to what I was going to finish this part up with, though. And he ends this piece with, understand that the question as to who manages to seize Weihai, Port Arthur, or Cuba, your government or another, does not affect you, or rather, that every such seizure made by your government injures you by inevitably bringing in its trail of all sorts of pressure on you by your government to force you to take part in the robbery and violence by which alone such seizures are made or can be retained when made. Understand that your life can in no way be bettered by Alsace becoming German or French, and Ireland or Poland being free or enslaved. Whoever holds them, you are free to live where you will, if even you be an Alsatian, an Irishman, or a Pole. Understand, too, that by stirring up patriotism, you only make the case worse, for the subjection in which your people are kept has resulted simply from the struggle between patriotisms, and every manifestation of patriotism in one nation provokes a corresponding reaction in another. Understand that salvation from your woes is only possible when you free yourself from the obsolete idea of patriotism and from the obedience to governments that it is based upon. And when you boldly enter into the region of that higher idea, the brotherly union of the peoples, which has long since come to life and from all sides is calling you to itself. If people would understand that they are not the sons of some fatherland or other, nor of governments, but are the sons of God, and can therefore neither be slaves nor enemies to one another, those insane, unnecessary, worn-out, pernicious organizations called governments, and all the sufferings, violations, humiliations, and crimes which they occasion would cease. Boom. Okay. I think I'm going to start repeating myself a lot as I sort of dissect a few of these. So I think I'm going to let the words stand on their own a little bit. A little bit about patriotism, a little bit about violence, armed service, and whatnot. I think I have one more section here. It's a little long, though. But I'm going to throw it in, I think. We're going to go way back towards the end here. This last bit sort of offers an explanation of life without governments, which I feel like is the only pushback to when people say live free. Whenever people like myself proudly state that I'm an agorist, an anarchist, and after explaining to them that I'm a peaceful one and not the black bloc stuff that Fox and CNN shows them, they go, well, what about this, that, the other thing, how to live without one? And I know Tolstoy sort of partially mentioned it, and that the question's worded incorrectly, but nonetheless, these last few pages sort of break that down. And this is now section 13 from, what essay are we on here? The Slavery of Our Times. The cause of the miserable condition of the workers is slavery. The cause of slavery is legislation. Legislation rests on organized violence. It follows that an improvement in the condition of the people is possible only through the abolition of organized violence. But organized violence is government, and how can we live without governments? Without governments, there will be chaos, anarchy. All the achievements of civilization will perish, and people will revert to their primitive barbarism. It is usual, not only for those to whom the existing order is profitable, but even for those to whom it is evidently unprofitable, but who are so accustomed to it that they cannot imagine life without governmental violence, to say we must not dare touch the existing order of things. The destruction of government will, they say, produce the greatest misfortunes, riot, theft, and murder, till finally the worst men will again seize power and enslave all the good people. The fact is that all these things, riots, thefts, and murders, followed by the rule of the wicked and the enslavement of the good, is what has happened and is happening. So the anticipation that the disturbance of the existing order will produce riots and disorder does not prove the present order to be good. Only touch the present order, and the greatest evils will follow. Only touch one brick of the 1,000 bricks piled into a narrow column several yards high, and all the bricks will tumble down and smash. But the fact that any brick extracted or any push administered will destroy such a column and smash the bricks certainly does not prove it to be wise to keep the bricks in such an unnatural and inconvenient position. On the contrary, it shows that bricks should not be piled in such a column, but that they should be arranged so that they may lie firmly, and so that they can be made use of without destroying the whole structure. It is the same with the present state of organizations. The state organization is extremely artificial and unstable, and the fact that the least push may destroy it not only does not prove that it is necessary, but, on the contrary, shows that if once upon a time it was necessary, it is now absolutely unnecessary and is therefore harmful and dangerous. It is harmful and dangerous because the effect of this organization on all the evil that exists in society is not to lessen and correct, but rather to strengthen and confirm that evil. It is strengthened and confirmed by either being justified and put in attractive forms or concealed. All that well-being of the people, which we see in so-called well-governed states ruled by violence, is but an appearance, a fiction. Everything that would disturb the external appearance of well-being, all the hungry people, the sick, the revoltingly vicious, are all hidden away where they cannot be seen. But the fact that we do not see them does not show that they do not exist. On the contrary, the more they are hidden, the more there will be of them, and the more cruel towards them will those be who are the cause of their condition. It is true that every interruption, and yet more every stoppage of the organized violence of government action disturbs this external appearance of well-being in our life, but such disturbance does not produce the disorder, but rather displays what was hidden and makes possible its amendment. Until, say, almost the end of the 19th century, people thought and believed that they could not live without governments, but life flows onward, and the conditions of life and people's views change. Notwithstanding the efforts of government to keep people in that childish condition in which an injured man feels as if it were better for him to have someone to complain to, people, especially the laboring people, both in Europe and in Russia, are more and more emerging from childhood and beginning to understand the true conditions of their life. You tell us that but for you we shall be conquered by neighboring nations, by the Chinese or the Japanese, men of the people now say, but we read the papers and know that no one is threatening to attack us, and that it is only you who govern us, who for some reason, unintelligible to us, exasperate each other, and then, under pretense of defending your people, ruin us with taxes for the maintenance of the fleet, for the armaments, or for strategic railways, which are only required to gratify your ambition and vanity. And then you arrange wars with one another, as you have now done against the peaceful Chinese. You say that you defend landed property for our advantage, but your defense has this effect, that all the land either has passed or is being passed into the control of rich banking companies which do not labor, while we, the immense majority of the people, are being deprived of land and left in the power of those who do not labor. You, with your laws of landed property, do not defend landed property, but take it from those who work it. You say you secure for each man the produce of his labor, but you do just the reverse. All those who produce articles of value are, thanks to your pseudo-protection, placed in such a position that they not only never receive the value of their labor, but are all their lives long in complete subjection to and in the power of non-workers. Thus do people at the end of the century begin to understand and to speak, and this awakening from the lethargy in which government have kept them is continuing and rapidly growing. Within the last 5 or 6 years, public opinion among the common folk, not only in the towns, but also in the villages, and not only in Europe, but also among us in Russia, has altered amazingly. It is said that without governments, we should not have those enlightening, educational, and public institutions that are needful for all. But why should we suppose this? Why think that non-official people could not arrange their lives for themselves as well as government people can arrange it not for themselves but for others? We see, on the contrary, that in the most diverse matters, people in our times arrange their own lives incomparably better than those who govern them arrange things for them. Without the least help from government, and often in spite of the interference of government, people organize all sorts of social undertakings. Workmen's unions, cooperative societies, railway companies, cartels, and syndicates. If collections for public works are needed, why should we suppose that free people could not, without violence, voluntarily collect the necessary means and carry out anything that is now carried out by the means of taxes, if only the undertakings in question are really useful for everybody? Why suppose that there cannot be tribunals without violence? Trial by people trusted by the disputants has always existed and will exist, and needs no violence. We are depraved by long-continued slavery, that we can hardly imagine administration without violence. Yet, that is not entirely true. Russian communes migrating to distant regions where our government leaves them alone arrange their own taxation, administration, tribunals, and police, and always prosper until governmental violence interferes with their administration. In the same way, there is no reason to suppose that people could not, by common agreement, decide how the land is to be appointed for use. I have known people, Cossacks of the Urals, who have lived without acknowledging private property in land. There was such well-being and order in their commune as does not exist in society where landed property is defended by violence. I know too of communes that live without acknowledging the right of individuals to private property. Within my recollection of the whole Russian peasantry did not accept the idea of landed property. The defense of landed property by governmental violence not only does not abolish the struggle for landed property, but on the contrary, intensifies that struggle and in many cases causes it. Were it not for the defense of landed property and its consequent rise in price, people would not be crowded into such narrow spaces, but would scatter over the free land of which there it is still so much in the world. But, as it is, continual struggle goes on for landed property, a struggle with the weapons government furnishes by means of its laws of landed property. In this struggle, it is not those who work on the land, but always those who take part in governmental violence who have the advantage. It is the same with reference to things produced by labor. Things really produced by a man's own labor and that he needs are always protected by custom, by public opinion, by feelings of justice and reciprocity, and they do not need to be protected by violence. Tens of thousands of acres of forest land belonging to one proprietor, while thousands of people close by have no fuel, need protection by violence. So too do factories and works where several generations of workmen have been defrauded and are still being defrauded, yet more do hundreds of thousands of bushels of grain belonging to one owner who has held them back to sell at triple the price in time of famine. But no man, however depraved, except a rich man or a government official, would take from a countryman living by his own labor the harvest he has raised, or the cow he has bred, from which he gets his milk for his children, or the sokas, the scythes and spades he has made and uses. If even a man were found who did take from another articles the latter had made and required, such a man would rouse against himself such indignation from everyone living in similar circumstances that he would hardly find his action profitable for himself. A man so immoral as to do it under such circumstances would be sure to do it under the strictest system of property defense by violence. It is generally said, only attempt to abolish the rights of property in land and in the produce of labor, and no one will take the trouble to work, lacking assurance that he will be able to retain what he has produced. We should say the opposite. The defense by violence of the rights of property immorally obtained, which is now customary, if it has not quite destroyed, has considerably weakened people's natural consciousness of justice in the matter of using articles. It has weakened the natural and innate right of property, without which humanity could not exist, and which has always existed and is still existing among all men. There is therefore no reason to anticipate that people will not be able to arrange their lives without organized violence. Of course, it may be said that horses and bulls must be guided by the violence of rational beings, men. But why must men be guided, not by some higher beings, but people such as themselves? Why ought people to be subject to the violence of just those men who are in power at a given time? What proves that these people are wiser than those whom they inflict violence? The fact that they allow themselves to use violence towards human beings indicates that they are not more, but less wise than those who submit to them. The examinations in China for the office of mandarin do not, we know, ensure that the wisest and best people should be placed in power. And this is just as little ensured by inheritance, or the whole machinery of promotions in rank, or the elections in constitutional countries. On the contrary, power is always seized by those who are less conscientious and less moral. It is said, how can people live without government, without violence? But it should rather be asked, how can rational people live, acknowledging the vital bond of their social life to be violence, and not reasonable agreement? One or another, people are rational beings, or they are irrational beings. If they are irrational beings, then they are all irrational, and then everything among them is decided by violence, and there is no reason why certain people should, and others should not, have a right to use violence. In that case, governmental violence has no justification. But if men are rational beings, then their relations should be based on reason, and not on the violence of those who happen to have seized power. In that case, again, governmental violence has no justification. Slavery results from laws. Laws are made by governments, and therefore people can only be freed from slavery by the abolition of governments. But how can governments be abolished? All attempts to get rid of governments by violence have hitherto always and everywhere resulted only in this, that in place of the deposed governments, new ones establish themselves, often more cruel than those are replaced. Besides these past attempts to abolish governments by violence, according to the socialist theory, the coming abolition of the rule of the capitalists, the communalization of the means of production, and the new economic order of society is also to be instituted by a fresh organization of violence, and will have to be maintained by the same means. So attempts to abolish violence by violence neither have in the past nor evidently can in the future emancipate people from violence, nor consequently from slavery. It cannot be otherwise. Apart from outbursts of revenge or anger, violence is used only in order to compel some people against their will to do the will of others. But being compelled to do what other people wish against your own will is slavery. Therefore, as long as any violence designed to compel some people to do the will of others exists, there will be slavery. All the attempts to abolish slavery by violence are like extinguishing fire with fire, stopping water with water, or filling up one hole by digging another. Therefore, the means of escape from slavery, if such means exist, must be found not in setting up fresh violence, but in abolishing whatever renders governmental violence possible. The possibility of governmental violence, like every other violence perpetrated by a small number of people upon a larger, has always depended and still depends simply on the fact that the small number are armed, while the larger number are unarmed, or that the small number are better armed than the larger. Well, that doesn't speak to our little special interest. That has been the case in all the conquests. In this way, the Greeks, the Romans, the Knights, and the Pizarros conquered nations, and it is thus that people are now conquered in Africa, in Asia, In the same way, in times of peace, all governments hold their subjects in subjection. As of old, so now, people rule over other people only because some are armed and others are not. In older times, the warriors with their chiefs fell upon the defenseless inhabitants, subdued them, and robbed them, and all divided the spoils in proportion to their participation, courage, and cruelty, and each warrior saw clearly that the violence he perpetrated was profitable to him. Now, armed men, taken chiefly from the working class, attack defenseless people, men on strike, rioters, or the inhabitants of other countries, and subdue them and rob them of the fruits of their labor, not for themselves, the assailants, but for the people who do not even take part in the subjugation. The difference between the conquerors and the governments is only that the conquerors themselves with the soldiers attacked the unarmed inhabitants, and in cases of subordination carried out their threats to torture and to kill, while the governments, in cases of insubordination, do not themselves torture or execute the unarmed inhabitants, but oblige others to do it, who have been deceived and specially brutalized for the purpose, and who are chosen from among the very people on whom the government inflicts violence. Thus, violence was formerly inflicted by personal effort, by the courage, cruelty, and agility of the conquerors themselves, but now violence is inflicted by means of fraud. The small number who rule, on obtaining power from their predecessors, installed by conquest to say the majority, there are a lot of you, but you are stupid and uneducated, and cannot either govern yourselves or organize your public affairs, and therefore we will assume those tasks ourselves. We will protect you from foreign foes and establish and uphold internal order among you. We will set up courts of justice, arrange and maintain public institutions for you, schools, roads, and the postal service, and in general, we will take care of your well-being. And in return, for all of this, you only have to fulfill certain slight demands which we make. And among other things, you must give into our complete control a small part of your incomes, and you must yourselves enter the armies which are needed for your own safety and government. Most people agree to this, not because they have weighed up the advantages and disadvantages of the conditions. They never have a chance to do that, but because from their very birth they have found themselves in conditions such as these. If doubts suggest themselves to some as to whether all of this is necessary, each thinks only about himself and fears to suffer if he refuses to accept these conditions. Each one hopes to take advantage of them for his own profit, and everyone agrees, thinking that by paying a small part of his means to the government and by consenting to military service, he cannot do himself very much harm. But as soon as the governments have the money and the soldiers, instead of fulfilling their promises and to defend their subjects from foreign enemies and to arrange things for their benefits, they do all they can to provoke the neighboring nations and to produce war. They not only do not promote the internal well-being of their people, but they ruin and corrupt them. In the Arabian Nights, there is a story of a traveler who, being cast upon a desert island, found a little old man with withered legs sitting on the ground by the side of a stream. The old man asked the traveler to take him on his shoulders and carry him over the stream. The traveler consented, but no sooner was the old man settled on the traveler's shoulders than he then twisted his legs around the traveler's neck and would not get off. Having control of the traveler, the old man drove him about as he liked, plucked fruit from the trees and ate himself, not giving any to his bearer, and abused him in every way. That is exactly what happens with the people who give soldiers and money to governments. With the money the governments buy guns and hire or train subservient, brutalized military commanders who, by means of an artful system of stupefaction perfected in the course of ages and called discipline, turn those who have been taken as soldiers into a disciplined army. Discipline consists in this, that people who are subjected to this training and remain under it for some time are completely deprived of all that is valuable in human life and of man's chief attribute, rational freedom. They become submissive, machine-like instruments of murder in the hands of their organized, hierarchical stratocracy. It is in this disciplined army that the essence of the fraud dwells, which gives to modern governments dominion over the peoples. When the governments have in their power this instrument of violence and murder that possesses no will of its own, the whole people are in their hands, and they do not let them go again, and not only prey upon them, but also abuse them, instilling into the people by means of pseudo-religious and patriotic education, loyalty to, and even adoration of themselves, the very men who torment the whole people by keeping them in slavery. It is not for nothing that all the kings, emperors, and presidents esteem discipline so highly, are so afraid of any breach of discipline, and attach the highest importance to reviews, maneuvers, parades, ceremonial marches, and other such nonsense. They know that it all maintains discipline, and that not only their power, but their very existence depends on discipline. Disciplined armies are the means by which they, without using their own hands, accomplish the greatest atrocities, the possibility of perpetrating which gives them the power over the people. The only means, therefore, to destroy governments is not by force, but by exposure of this fraud. It is necessary people should understand two things. Firstly, that in Christendom there is no need to protect the people one from another, that the enmity of the people one to another is produced by the governments themselves, and that armies are only needed for the advantage of the small number who rule. For the people it is not only unnecessary, but it is the highest degree harmful, serving as an instrument to enslave them. Secondly, that the discipline which is so highly esteemed by all governments is the greatest crime that man can commit, and is a clear indication of the criminality of the aims of governments. Discipline is the suppression of reason and of freedom in man, and can have no aim other than preparation for the performance of crimes such as no man can commit while in a normal condition. It is not even needed for war when the war is defensive and national, as the Boers have recently shown. It is wanted, and wanted only for the purpose indicated by Wilhelm II, for the preparation of the greatest crimes, fratricide and parricide. The terrible old man who sat on the traveler's shoulders behaved as the governments do. He mocked him and insulted him, knowing that as long as he sat on the traveler's neck, the latter was in his power. It is just this terrible fraud which should be exposed in order that the abolition of government and of the slavery that results from it may become possible. The German writer Eugene Schmidt, in the newspaper Onstadt, I think is how you say it, which he published in Budapest, wrote an article that was profoundly true and bold, not only in expression but in thought. In it he showed that governments, justifying their existence on the ground that they ensure a certain kind of safety to their subjects, are like the Calabrian robber chief who collected a regular tax from all who wished to travel in safety along the highways. Schmidt was committed for trial for that article, but was acquitted by the jury. We are so hypnotized by the government that such a comparison seems to us an exaggeration, a paradox, a joke, but in reality it is not a paradox or a joke. The only inaccuracy in the comparison is that the activity of all the governments is many times more inhuman and, above all, more harmful than the activity of the Calabrian robber. He generally plundered the rich, they generally plunder the poor and protect those rich men who assist in their crimes. The robber doing his work risked his life, while the governments risked nothing, but based their whole activity on lies and deception. The robber did not compel anyone to join his band. The governments generally enroll their soldiers by force. All who paid the tax to the robber had equal security from danger, but in the state, the more anyone takes part in the organized fraud, the more he receives not merely of protection, but also reward. Most of all, the emperors, kings, and presidents are protected, with their perpetual bodyguards, and they can spend the largest share of the money collected from the tax-paying subjects. Next in the scale of participation in governmental crimes come the commanders-in-chief, the ministers, the heads of police, governors, and so on, down to the policemen, who are least protected and who receive the smallest salaries of all. Those who do not take part in any of the crimes of government, who refuse to serve, to pay taxes, or to go to law, are subjected to violence, as among the robbers. The robber does not intentionally corrupt people, but the governments, to accomplish their ends, corrupt whole generations from childhood to manhood with false religious and patriotic instruction. Above all, not even the most cruel robber, and it looks like he names a few here, no Stenka Raisin, no Cartouche, can be compared for cruelty, pitilessness, and ingenuity in torturing. I will not say with the villain kings notorious for their cruelty, John the Terrible, Louis the XI, the Elizabeths, etc., but even with the present constitutional and liberal governments, with their solitary cells, disciplinary battalions, suppressions of revolts, and their massacres in war. Towards governments, as towards churches, it is impossible to feel otherwise than with veneration or aversion. Until a man has understood what a government is, and until he has understood what a church is, he cannot but feel a veneration for those institutions. As long as he is guided by them, his vanity makes it necessary for him to think what guides him is something primal, great, and holy. But as soon as he understands that what guides him is not something primal and holy, but that it is a fraud carried out by unworthy people who, under the pretense of guiding him, make use of him for their own personal ends, he cannot but at once feel aversion towards these people. And the more important the part of his life that has been guided, the more aversion he will feel. People cannot but feel this when they have understood what governments are. People must feel that their participation in the criminal activity of governments, whether by giving part of their work in the form of money or by direct participation in military service, is not, as is generally supposed, an indifferent action, but besides being useful to oneself and one's brothers, is a participation in the crimes unceasingly committed by all governments and a preparation for new crimes which governments, by maintaining disciplined armies, are always planning. The age of veneration for governments, despite all the hypnotic influence they enjoy to maintain their position, is more and more passing away. And it is time for people to understand that governments not only are not necessary, but are harmful and highly immoral institutions in which an honest, self-respecting man cannot and must not take part, and the advantages of which he cannot and should not enjoy. And as soon as people clearly understand this, they will naturally cease to take part in such deeds, i.e., cease to give the government soldiers and money. And as soon as a majority of people cease to do this, the fraud which enslaves people will be abolished. Only in this way can people be freed from slavery. On to the last section here. What should each man do? But all these are general considerations, and whether they are correct or not, they are inapplicable to life, will be the remark made by people accustomed to their position and who do not consider it possible or desirable to change it. Tell us what to do and how to organize society, is what people of the well-to-do classes will usually say. They are so accustomed to their role of slave owners that when there is talk of improving the workers' condition, they at once begin, like our self-owners before the emancipation, to devise all sorts of plans for their slaves, but it never occurs to them that they have no right to dispose of other people, and that if they really wish to do good to people, the only thing they can and should do is to cease to do evil that they are doing now. That evil is very definite and clear. It is not merely that they employ compulsory slave labor and do not wish to cease from employing it, but that they also take part in establishing and maintaining this compulsion of labor. That is what they should cease to do. The working people are so perverted by their compulsory slavery that it seems to most of them that if their position is a bad one, it is the fault of the masters, who pay them too little, and who own the means of production. It does not enter their heads that their position depends entirely on themselves, and that if only they wish to improve their own and their brother's position, and not merely each to do the best they can for himself, the main thing for them to do is themselves to cease to do evil. And the evil they do is that, desiring to improve their material position by the very means which have brought them into bondage, the workers, for the sake of satisfying the habits they have adopted, sacrifice their human dignity and freedom, and accept humiliating and immoral employment, or produce unnecessary and harmful articles, and above all, they maintain governments, taking part in them and paying taxes, and by direct service, and thus enslave themselves. In order that the state of things may be improved, both the well-to-do classes and the workers must understand that improvements can be effected by safeguarding one's own interests. Service involves sacrifice, and therefore, if people really wish to improve the position of their brother men, and not merely their own, they must be ready not only to alter the way of life of which they are accustomed, and to lose those advantages which they have held, but they must be prepared for an intense struggle, not against governments, but against themselves and their families, and must be ready to suffer persecution for non-fulfillment of the demands of government. Therefore, the answer to the question, what must we do, is very simple and not merely theoretical, but always in the highest degree applicable and practical for every man. Although it is not what is expected from those who, like people of the well-to-do classes, are fully convinced that they are appointed to correct not themselves, they are already good, but people of other and from those who, like the workmen, are sure that they, but only the capitalists, are to blame, that their position is so bad, and think that things can only be put right by taking from the capitalists the things that they use and arranging it so that they all may make use of those conveniences of life which are now used by the rich. Wholly run-on sentence. The answer is very definite, applicable, and practicable, for it demands the activity of that one person over whom each of us has real, rightful, and unquestionable power, namely oneself. And it consists in this, that if a man, whether slave or a slave owner, really wishes to better not his position alone, but the position of people in general, he must himself not do those wrong things which enslave him and his brothers. In order to not do the evil which produces misery for himself and for his brothers, he should firstly neither willingly nor under compulsion take any part in government activity, and should therefore neither a soldier, nor a field marshal, nor a minister of state, nor a tax collector, nor a witness, nor an alderman, nor a juryman, nor a governor, nor a member of parliament, nor in fact hold any office connected with violence. That is one thing. Secondly, such a man should not voluntarily pay taxes to governments, either directly or indirectly, nor should he accept money collected by taxes, either as salary or as pension or as a reward, nor should he make use of government institutions supported by taxes collected by violence from the people. That is the second thing. Thirdly, such a man should not appeal to government violence for the protection of his possessions in land or in other things, nor to defend him and his near ones, but should only possess land and all products of his own or other people's toil, insofar as others do not claim them from him. But such an activity is impossible to refuse all participation in government affairs. It means to refuse to live, is what people will say. A man who refuses military service will be imprisoned. A man who does not pay taxes will be punished, and the tax will be collected from his property. A man who, having no other means of livelihood, refuses government service will perish of hunger with his family. The same will befall a man who rejects government protection for his property and his person. Not to make use of things that are taxed or of government institutions is quite impossible, as the most necessary articles are often taxed. And just in the same way it is impossible to do without government institutions, such as the post and the roads. Went over that though. It is quite true that it is difficult for a man of our time to stand aside from all participation in government violence, but the fact that not everyone can so arrange his life as not to participate in some degree in government violence does not at all show that it is not possible to free oneself from it more and more. Not every man will have the strength to refuse conscription, though there are and will be such men, but each man can abstain from voluntarily entering the military, the police force, or the judicial or revenue service, and can give the preference to a worse paid private service rather than to be better paid public service. Not every man will have the strength to renounce his landed estates, though there are some people who do that, but every man can, understanding the wrongfulness of such property, diminish its extent. Not every man can renounce the possession of capital, though there are some who do, or the use of articles defended by violence, but each man can, by diminishing his own requirements, be less and less in need of articles which provoke other people to envy. Not every official can renounce his government salary, though there are men who prefer hunger to dishonest government employment, but everyone can prefer a smaller salary to a larger one, for the sake of having duties less bound up with violence. Not everyone can refuse to make use of government schools, though there are some who do, but everyone can give the preference to private schools. And each can make less and less use of articles that are taxed and of government institutions. Between the existing order based on brute force and the ideal of a society based on reasonable agreement confirmed by custom, there are an infinite number of steps which mankind is ascending, and the approach to the ideal is only accomplished to the extent to which people free themselves from participation in violence, from taking advantage of it, and from being accustomed to it. We do not know and cannot guess, and still less can we, like the pseudo-scientific men, foretell in any what way this gradual weakening of governments and emancipation of the people will come about. Nor do we know what new forms man's life will take as the gradual emancipation progresses, but we do know certainly that the life of people who, having understood the criminality and harmfulness of the activity of governments, strive not to make use of them or to take part in them, will be quite different and more in accord with the law of life and with our conscience than the present life, in which people, while themselves participating in government violence and taking advantage of it, make a pretense of struggling against it and try to destroy the old violence by new violence. The chief thing is that the present arrangement of life is bad. About that, all are agreed. The cause of the bad conditions and of the existing slavery lies in the violence used by government. There is only one way to abolish government violence. It is that people should abstain from participating in violence. Therefore, whether it be difficult or not to abstain from participating in government violence, and whether the good results of such abstinence will or will not be soon apparent, are superfluous questions. Because to liberate people from slavery, there is only one way and no other. To what extent and when voluntary agreement confirmed by custom will replace violence in each society and in the whole world will depend on the strength and the clearness of people's consciousness, and on the number of individuals who make this consciousness their own. For each of us is a separate person, and each can be a participant in the general movement of humanity by his greater or lesser clearness of recognition of the aim before us, or he can be an opponent of progress. Each will have to make his choice, either oppose the will of God, building upon the stands the unstable house of his brief and elusive life, or to join the eternal deathless movement of true life in accord with God's will. Fuck, that's fire. To join in the eternal deathless movement of true life in accord with God's will. That's some Warhammer shit. But perhaps I am mistaken, and the right conclusions to draw from human history are not these, and the human race is not moving towards emancipation from slavery. Perhaps it can be proved that violence is a necessary factor for progress, and that the state, with its violence, is a necessary form of life, and that it will be worse for people if governments are abolished, and if the defense of our persons and property is abolished. Let us grant it to be so, and say that all the foregoing reasoning is wrong. But besides the general considerations about the life of humanity, each man has also to face the question of his own life, and notwithstanding any considerations about the general laws of life, a man cannot do what he admits to be, not merely harmful, but wrong. Very possibly the reasoning showing the state to be a necessary form of development of the individual and government violence to be necessary for the good of society can all be deduced from history and are correct, each honest and sincere man of our time will reply. But murder is an evil. That I know more certainly than any reasonings. By demanding that I should enter the army, or pay for hiring and equipping soldiers, or for buying cannons and building battleships, you wish to make me an accomplice in murder, and that I cannot and not will be, neither do I wish to, nor can I make use of money you have collected from hungry people with threats of murder, nor do I wish to make use of land or capital defended by you, because I know that your defense of it rests on murder. I could do these things when I did not understand all their criminality, but once I have seen it, I cannot avoid seeing it, and can no longer take part in these things. I know that we are all so bound up by violence that it is difficult to avoid it altogether, but I will, nevertheless, do all that I can not to take part in it. I will not be an accomplice to it, and will try not to make use of what is obtained and defended by murder. I have but one life. And why should I, in this brief life of mine, act contrary to the voice of conscience and become an accomplice in your abominable deeds? I cannot, and I will not. What will come of this, I do not know, only I think no harm can result from acting as my conscience demands. So, in our time, should each honest and sincere man reply to all the arguments about the necessity of governments and of violence, and to every demand of invitation to take part in them. The conclusion to which general reasoning should bring us is thus confirmed to each individual by that supreme and unimpeachable judge, the voice of conscience. But this again is the same old sermon, on one hand urging the destruction of the present order of things without putting anything in its place, and, on the other hand, exhorting to non-action, is what many will say on reading what I have written. Government action is bad. So is the action of the landowner and of the businessman. Equally bad is the activity of the socialist and of the revolutionary anarchist. That is to say, all real practical activities are bad, and only some sort of moral, spiritual, indefinite activity which brings about everything to utter chaos and inaction is good. Thus I know many serious and sincere people will say, What seems to people most disturbing in the idea of nonviolence is that property will not be protected, and that each man will, therefore, be able to take from another man what he needs or merely likes and go unpunished. To people accustomed to the defense of property and person by violence, it seems that without such defense there will be perpetual disorder, a constant struggle of everyone against everyone else. I will not repeat what I have said elsewhere to show that the defense of property by violence does not lessen but increases this disorder, but allowing that in the absence of defense, disorder may occur, what are people to do who have understood the cause of the calamities from which they are suffering? If we have understood that we are ill from drunkenness, we must not continue to drink, hoping to mend matters by drinking moderately or taking medicines that short-sighted doctors give us. It is the same with our social sickness. If we have understood that we are ill because some people use violence on others, we cannot improve the position of society either by continuing to support the government violence that exists or by introducing a fresh kind of revolutionary or socialist violence. That might have been done as long as the fundamental cause of people's misery was not clearly seen. But as soon as it has become indubitably clear that other people suffer from the violence done by some to others, it becomes impossible to improve the position by continuing the old violence or by introducing a new kind. As a sick man suffering from alcoholism has only one way to be cured, by refraining from intoxicants which are the cause of his illness, so there is only one way to free men from the evil arrangement of society, and that is to refrain from violence, the cause of the suffering, from preaching violence, and from in any way justifying violence. Not only is this the only way to deliver people from their ills, but we must also adopt it, because it coincides with the moral consciousness of each individual man of our time. If a man of our day has once understood that every defense of property or person by violence is obtained only by threatening to murder or by murdering, he can no longer, with a quiet conscience, make use of that which is obtained by murder or by the threat of murder, and still less can take part in the murder or in threatening to murder. So, what is wanted to free people from their misery is also needed for the satisfaction of the moral consciousness of every individual. For each individual, therefore, there can be no doubt that both the general good and to fulfill the law of his life, he must neither take part in violence, nor justify it, nor make use of it. And with that, and with my voice failing and my focus being unable to look at any more words, I know I probably butchered a lot of that this morning. We're well into the afternoon now. Is a majority of the anarchist works that Leo Tolstoy made. You can find a lot of these too. I will publish a picture of the names of all of these in this book. I'm pretty sure you can find all of them online for free in PDFs. I highly suggest you do that because they're incredible. They all read like that. They are all very powerful. They're all very, I'd say they're all pretty badass in that sense. And I just thought it was important to share some of that, considering we just had an election, a very contentious election, and we're going to move forward now as brothers and sisters. I saw a lot of people thumping some divisive, political lines, and you have every right to do that. But hopefully this sort of makes it clear in my mind, or makes it clear in your mind, rather, why I believe what I do, why I preach, what I do. I'm not saying I am the chaplain by any means, but this is just to sort of give a little bit of a context to, why I am who I am, why I believe what I believe. And hey, maybe it helped enlighten you too. I'm not here to convert the non-believers by any means, but I thought and still think to this day, this is some of the most relevant and powerful and useful, I think, writings on, change, on governments. And I think it's especially applicable to what's happening today. I think as people, our time horizons, our attention spans are so short that as soon as another election comes up, we truly do believe, oh man, they're going to change everything. The whole thing's going to change. He's going to get in there. He's going to really shake it up. Meanwhile, every single president has promised that on the campaign trail. It's never gotten done throughout all of history, but we happen to just forget that, I guess. Maybe that's just our blind optimism, which is cool to be optimistic, but it's also good to be realistic and to be honest with ourselves as to what we are supporting, I think. So with that, I'm going to sign off. My voice is giving out. I hope you enjoyed the weekend. Hope you all stay safe out there. Stay healthy. Stay happy. Go do something you love. I'm probably going to edit this while I watch football after a very long night of drinking and cigars with the boys, which was a lot of fun. So definitely have fun. Stay healthy. Go to the gym. Stay sharp. And yeah, just don't get caught up in the noise of the world. It's always something I've preached, but I think it's important to not care about such frivolous things as, whether the trolley is red or blue in the trolley problem. The trolley problem will exist no matter what. It doesn't matter what color it is. So with that, take care, stay metal. Thank you.